On the morning of April 13th, 1992, people walking into their offices in downtown Chicago had no idea anything was wrong. The streets were dry. The sky was clear. It was a normal Monday in the Loop, but in the basement of the Merchandise Mart, one of the largest buildings in the world, fish were swimming past the furnace room. The water was rising, cold and dark, and nobody on the street above could see it. To understand what happened that morning, you have to go back much further, not to the 1990s, not even to the 1900s. You have to go back to the ground itself. Chicago was built on what geologists call lacustrine clay, the sediment left behind when a massive glacial lake retreated at the end of the last ice age. That lake, sometimes called Lake Chicago, preceded Lake Michigan. When it drained, it left behind thousands of years of accumulated silt, soft and saturated. The ground underneath the city had the approximate consistency of wet soap. This caused problems from the very beginning. In 1856, the city of Chicago did something that had never been done before and has rarely been done since. It raised itself. The entire downtown district was physically lifted, sometimes by as much as 14 feet, using thousands of jack screws operated by crews working in coordination across the city. Buildings, hotels, and city blocks were lifted while people continued to live and work inside them. George Pullman, who would later become famous for his railroad sleeping cars, coordinated part of that effort. The goal was to install sewer and drainage infrastructure beneath streets that had previously been too low to drain. It worked, mostly. But the soil problem never went away. When the first generation of tall buildings began rising in the Loop after the Great Fire of 1871, engineers discovered almost immediately that Chicago's ground would not cooperate with conventional foundations. Early structures sank. The Monadnock Building, completed in 1893 at 16 stories, required foundations so massive they alone consumed a significant portion of the budget. At its base, the walls were 6 feet thick. The building still settled several inches after construction. By the 1890s, the downtown was dense, lucrative, and geologically treacherous, and it was also, above the ground, completely gridlocked. The Loop in the 1890s was not a pleasant place to move through. 6 major railroad terminals surrounded the downtown core, and each one fed wagons into the streets. Wagons loaded with coal, merchandise, mail, and construction debris. Horse-drawn carts competed with electric streetcars on streets that had been laid out in an era when Chicago was a fraction of its current size. Congestion was constant. In winter, the streets turned to frozen mud. In summer, the smell was considerable. Commerce moved slowly, and the cost of moving anything through the downtown was high. It was this situation, the daily grind of surface congestion, that pushed a group of businessmen toward an unusual idea. Rather than fighting for space on the streets, they would go underneath them. In 1899, the Illinois Telephone and Telegraph Company applied for and received a franchise from the city of Chicago to lay telephone cables under downtown streets. The city approved the plan. What the city did not know, or perhaps chose not to examine too closely, was what the company was actually building. Construction began that year in the basement of a saloon at the corner of Washington and Canal Streets. Workers dug by hand through the blue clay layer that sat 40 feet below street level. They worked at night. They hauled the excavated soil away in wagons after midnight to avoid drawing attention. The tunnels they were carving out were not cable conduits. They were 7.5 feet tall and 6 feet wide, with concrete walls and a floor laid with 2-foot gauge railroad track. This was not a wiring project. It was a railroad. By 1902, 26 miles of tunnel had been completed before the city council realized what was happening. Officials were, according to transit historian Bruce Moffett, shocked, though perhaps more at the lost franchise revenue than at the audacity of the project. Negotiations followed. An ordinance was passed in 1903, and the company reorganized under a succession of names before becoming the Chicago Tunnel Company. The scale of what was eventually built is difficult to visualize from the surface. By 1914, the Chicago Tunnel Company had completed roughly 60 miles of interconnected tunnels running beneath nearly every street in the Loop and extending north of the Chicago River. The tunnels followed the street grid directly, meaning a person who knew the system could navigate it using an ordinary city map. There were 19 elevators connecting tunnel level to building basements, and 5 public freight stations where businesses without direct tunnel access could drop off or pick up shipments. At its peak, the system operated 132 electric locomotives and over 2,000 freight cars. The cars were small, about 10 feet long and 5 feet wide, purpose-built for the confined space. They carried coal to the boiler rooms of office buildings and department stores, then carried the ash back out for disposal. They carried merchandise that had arrived at rail terminals on the city's edge and needed to reach the basements of places like Marshall Field's department store on State Street. They hauled away excavation debris from construction sites, some of which was used as landfill along the lakefront, in areas that would become Grant Park, Soldier Field, and eventually McCormick Place. In 1906, the year revenue service began. The company ran trains between 4 public stations and 40 online customers. By 1913, the system was moving over 617,000 short tons of freight per year. The trains ran from 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, with limited overnight service for coal and ash. A telephone-based dispatching system coordinated movement at every street intersection, with dial phones installed at regular intervals so engineers could reach the central dispatcher without stopping. Most people who worked in the loop had no idea any of this was happening beneath their feet. Some building managers discovered tunnel connections already built into their sub-basements when Chicago Tunnel Company representatives came knocking, announced that their building had freight service, and offered to begin deliveries. There was no consultation beforehand. The company simply dug toward a building, punched through the basement wall, installed an elevator, and presented the owner with an option to subscribe. George W. Jackson managed the construction subcontracting, and James Stillman of the National City Bank of New York arranged a second round of financing that allowed the network to reach its eventual full extent. The project was backed at various points by E. H. Harriman and Jacob Schiff, names associated with the largest railroad and banking operations of the Gilded Age. The tunnel system worked well for about 30 years. Then the conditions that had made it necessary began to change. Motor trucks became practical and affordable through the 1920s and 1930s. Unlike tunnel trains, trucks could pick up a shipment at a rail yard and deliver it directly to a loading dock without the double handling required by the underground transfer system. Every ton of freight that entered the tunnel network had to be unloaded from a standard gauge rail car, reloaded onto a tunnel car, transported underground, reloaded onto an elevator, and transferred again at the other end. Trucks eliminated most of those steps. Then, in 1939, the city began constructing the subway tunnels that would eventually become the Chicago Transit Authority's rapid transit lines. Those subway excavations cut through the freight tunnel network in several locations, severing connections that had linked important customers. The geometry of the two systems was incompatible, and nobody in city government felt much urgency about preserving the freight routes. Buildings switched from coal to natural gas through the 1940s and 1950s. Eliminating the most consistent category of freight the tunnel had reliably carried since its opening. Revenue fell. Maintenance costs did not. The Chicago Tunnel Company declared bankruptcy in 1959 and ceased operations. The tunnels were transferred to city ownership. Most connections were bricked over. A few sections were converted to carry utility cables and steam pipes. The rest sat empty. For 3 decades, the 60-mile network simply existed in the dark, unmapped in many places, unknown to most of the people who passed above it every day. The city occasionally acknowledged that the tunnels existed, but provided little public information about their extent or condition. Then came April 13th, 1992. Several months earlier, in the fall of 1991, a contractor hired to drive new pilings for the Kinsey Street Bridge had punched a hole in the roof of one of the old freight tunnels running beneath the Chicago River. The hole was small. It was noticed and reported. The city was informed. Nothing was done. On the morning of April 13th, the pressure differential between the river above and the empty tunnel below finally forced the breach wide open. Water poured in. Within hours, nearly 250 million gallons of Chicago River water had surged through the network. The system's interconnected design, the same quality that had made it so efficient as a freight railroad, meant that water spread rapidly in every direction. Buildings connected to the tunnels, many of them unaware those connections still existed, began flooding from below. The Merchandise Mart, City Hall, the Chicago Board of Trade, the basements of dozens of Loop office buildings. Electrical systems failed. Boilers went out. The city evacuated hundreds of thousands of workers from the Loop on a sunny Monday morning, while an invisible flood spread 40 feet underground. Mayor Richard M. Daley, less than 3 years into his first term, mobilized the city's emergency response. Deputy Chief of Staff Gary Chico later described the evacuation as unlike anything the city had experienced. Loop streets were cleared of workers. The area stayed largely shut for 2 full days. Some buildings remained closed for weeks. The man who stopped the flood was John Kenny Jr., owner of Kenny Construction. His crew worked around the clock, using large rock to slow the flow enough to allow plugging shafts to be positioned. It took 7 days to seal the breach, several more days to pump out the buildings. The total cost of the disaster was estimated at close to $2 billion. What nobody missed, once the basements dried out and the lights came back on, was the central irony. A construction crew working on a bridge over the Chicago River had accidentally ruptured a tunnel that the city officially barely acknowledged existed. The resulting flood was one of the costliest urban disasters in Illinois history, and it had been triggered by a piece of infrastructure that most Chicagoans had never heard of. The tunnels are still there. After 1992, the city undertook a serious mapping effort and installed watertight bulkheads at intervals throughout the network to prevent a recurrence. Some sections carry fiber optic cables and utility lines, much as the original telephone franchise had promised over a century ago. The rest remains sealed and dark, accessible only to the city's Department of Water Management, which has declined repeated requests to release detailed information about the tunnel routes, citing security concerns. A handful of electric locomotives and freight cars from the Chicago Tunnel Company survived and are preserved at the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois. Locomotive 508, one of the small electric engines that once pulled ash cars through the Loop at midnight, sits in a museum display. It is one of the only physical remnants of a system that once moved over 500,000 carloads of freight per year through the center of one of the busiest cities in America. The excavated clay from those original tunnels, hauled away by the wagon load during construction between 1899 and 1914, became the ground under Grant Park. When people walk along the lakefront, past Buckingham Fountain, or toward the museum campus, some of what is underfoot came from 40 feet below the Loop, dug out by hand in the middle of the night by workers who were not supposed to be building what they were building. The Mecca Flats, a famous residential building on the south side that was demolished in 1952, left another underground trace. In July 2018, when maintenance crews were digging a trench near Crown Hall at the Illinois Institute of Technology, they broke through and found the intact tile flooring of the old building still preserved underground, its colors still bright after decades of burial. Chicago is full of layers like that. Things built, things forgotten, things broken through accidentally. The soil that once frustrated every engineer who tried to put a foundation in it turned out to be extraordinarily good at preserving what got buried. The blue clay is cold and stable and nearly airless. Things put into it tend to stay. What happened on April 13th, 1992 was not a disaster caused by the past. It was caused by the present ignoring the past, by a contractor working from incomplete maps, by a city that had let an old piece of infrastructure go unexamined, long enough that a small reported breach became a 9-figure catastrophe. The tunnels that were built in secret more than a century ago are still under the streets of downtown Chicago. The clay that swallowed them is the same clay that once sat at the bottom of a glacial lake before Chicago existed, before the Great Fire, before the skyscrapers and the freight trains and the saloon basement where someone started digging in 1899 with no intention of stopping. The city above changes constantly. The ground below keeps its records well.